Yo, it's your boy Logos, and today I'm going to be at the Thomas Sowell talk about the brutalities and consequences of conquest. I think it's a very relevant topic, especially nowadays with people trying to rewrite history or create pseudo-history for their own benefit. And I don't care if they think they're doing it for a virtuous reason, I still believe it's wrong. History is about the facts, and race swapping, gender swapping, or changing their, I don't know, life or place of origin is wrong. That is not real history in my opinion. That's just fantasy. And if you want to do fantasy writing, that's fine. But still put that in your title or say that up front. Don't call it a documentary, nor should you call it real history. I don't need somebody to look like me to be inspired by them. Julius Caesar, my favorite person from history, especially military wise, and he doesn't look like me, didn't grow up in the same time period as me, and definitely doesn't have the same experiences as me, but he still is inspirational for me because of his mind and the way that he did have some feeling of inadequacy at certain points of his life. But he kept grinding and he got to a point where we talk about him every single day. We have a whole month named after him. His adopted nephew, Augustus, created the Roman Empire inspired by him. And certain stuff like him being, I don't know, feeling the fear to Alexander the Great once he visited his gravesite. I find that stuff very relatable. Just because somebody doesn't look like you doesn't mean they can't teach you something or you can be inspired by them. But that's just my experience. People that claim to care about history or make these documentaries about history, like Jada Pinkett Smith and that so-called director or historians that they so-called had on, so-called experts, I don't know, those people didn't seem like they truly cared about history. They just want to put out a political ideology or their own personal belief. I love history no matter who's it coming from, or I don't know who the figure may be. They may be messed up or they might did some bad things, but regardless, it's all wisdom and knowledge. But let's see what Thomas Sowell got to say to us, because he's a founder of knowledge and wisdom, and he does get enough shine compared to what he should get. Let's get into it.
At one period of history or another, conquest has encompassed virtually all peoples, either as conquerors or as victims, and the consequences have been wide-ranging as well. Some conquests have been followed by systematic exterminations of the vanquished, as in Rome's conquest of Carthage, nor have such draconian policies been limited to major conquerors of historic dimensions. The massacres of the Tutsi by the Hutu and vice versa in late 20th century Africa and ethnic cleansing in the Balkan Wars of the same era clearly show that it does not take a great power to create great human tragedies. Nor have the much idealized Polynesians been immune. On the Chatham Islands, 500 miles east of New Zealand, centuries of independence came to a brutal end for the Moriori people in December 1835. On November 19th of that year, a ship carrying 500 Maori armed with guns, clubs, and axes arrived, followed on December 5th by a shipload of 400 more Maori. Groups of Maori began to walk through Moriori settlements, announcing that the Moriori were now their slaves, and killing those who objected. A Maori conqueror explained, "We took possession in accordance with our customs, and we caught all the people. Not one escaped. Some ran away from us. These we killed, and others we killed. But what of that? It was in accordance with our customs." Spontaneous atrocities and deliberate, systematic terror have long marked the path of the conqueror. The Mongol hordes who swept across vast reaches of Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East cultivated an image of ruthless barbarities as a calculated strategy to demoralize future victims. But although the Mongols excelled in such practices, they had no monopoly of them. The Normans did the same. Emperor Basil II of the Byzantine Empire in the 11th century ordered the blinding of 99 of every 100 Bulgarian captives, leaving each 100th man with only one eye to lead the others back home, so as to provide graphic evidence of the emperor's treatment of his enemies. It was a common practice in the Ottoman Empire to present the Sultan with pyramids of severed heads of enemy soldiers, usually defenseless prisoners, sometimes numbering in the thousands. 20th century conquests have been equally hideous. The Japanese conquest of the Chinese capital of Nanking in 1937 was followed by an orgy of rapes of thousands of women living there, the use of Chinese soldiers and civilians for bayonet practice, and a general wanton slaughter of civilians. Similar atrocities marked Japanese conquests throughout Southeast Asia during the Second World War.
I just think it's kind of ridiculous when I hear people in the West, especially in modern times, say they have it harder now than their ancestors, men or women. Because us men, we haven't been to war the way our fathers or well great grandfathers did go to war. World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, etc., etc. Going back to ancient times, uh, often you would just get picked off your farm or picked off your village or whatever, get thrown some armor, hopefully, and you have to serve in the front lines as some infantry. Only the rich and powerful have horses, and oftentimes, if you did lose in battle, that was your best way of getting away. But if you're just a man that's just a blacksmith, son of a blacksmith, you really can't get away unless you're lucky. And the only way you're lucky is if a lot of other sons of blacksmith, sons of, I don't know, people that train horses that are low level, just people that have like average everyday menial jobs, those people have to get killed in your place instead. So this whole idea that men or women had it easier or better back then is just ridiculous. Women in the same way. I fear women nowadays, usually just women that are very crazy or have no idea of knowledge, say that women go through more now than they ever did before. And that's ridiculous. Genghis Khan and his whole, I don't know, pillaging and raping of Asia tells so much differently. Women throwing themselves off walls to avoid being, I don't know, victims of rape or sexual assault from Mongol horsemen or Mongol soldiers. Genghis Khan makes up how much of the people of Mongolia or Asia and the like DNA? All that stuff wasn't consensual. So this idea that ancient times was nicer or easier, just nonsense. Straight up nonsense.
Their allies, the Nazis in Germany, set new lows for brutality and dehumanization, of which the Holocaust against the Jews was only the worst example. While conquest has often produced horrifying tragedies, its consequences have extended far beyond those tragedies. In some cases, where whole ways of life have changed in the wake of conquest, later generations of the conquered peoples have been born into an enlarged world of ideas, of technology, and of possibilities undreamed of by their ancestors. It is both unnecessary and impossible to determine the net advantages or disadvantages of conquest. Often the benefits and the losses have each been of staggering dimensions and long durations, with consequences that have been cultural, institutional, and biological. The ever-changing technology of warfare has been no more evenly spread among the peoples of the world than other cultural advantages. Mastery of fighting on horseback made Central Asians the greatest conquerors in the world for centuries on end, winning victories and empires from China to Eastern Europe. Only after the development of more formidable fortifications and the invention and perfection of handguns and cannon was the cavalry charge drastically reduced in its effectiveness, changing the balance of power among peoples and giving rise to new nations and empires based on the new technology. The rise of gunpowder weapons in particular marked the rise of Europeans as conquerors on the world stage, whereas before then Europe had had difficulties even defending itself against the invasions of Mongols, Turks, and Moors. It was symbolic of this dramatic turnaround that the year the Spaniards finally liberated the last of their country from Moorish rule was the same year when Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, marking the beginning of the age of European worldwide empires.
The whole thing about like Mongol hordes, or not even just Mongol steppe hordes, that's the place that most of these like horseback tribal empires start up in, like in the steppe of like Asia. So many of them use the bow so effectively. So at that point, especially with the speed and the reload power, the amount of arrows they carry, and the tactics they use like feign retreat, that was the closest you could get to a gun at the time until you could actually get a gun that could reload fast enough and accurate enough to take out multiple horsemen to break their charge or break their morale. So this whole idea that Europe was always at the top is, of course, a lie. And it goes back even before, the Byzantines and way before the gun. You had the Romans, they fell partially to Attila. And then after that, you had Timurid. I think that was after Genghis Khan. It just repeated cycle of these steppe nomads coming out of nowhere into Europe, or even going south into like Asia, like Armenia, Anatolia, ancient Anatolia, modern day Turkey, and just causing destruction happen over and over again. The Turks with the Byzantines, they just come out of nowhere, and their way of, I don't know, using the bow mixed with the steppe tactics against a primarily infantry, non-horseback civilization is, I don't know, dominated. And it's kind of funny too, because the people on horseback saw the people that lived in city as like insects or less than people, like they need to be herded like sheep. But it's funny because flip, the people in cities saw them as barbarians. It's just all about perspective. And when you want to conquer somebody and get their stuff or take over their cities or territory, you can come up with any excuse you want to do it.
The very nature of European dominance evolved in step with the evolution of guns and cannon. Early, crude, inaccurate, and slow-loading firearms had no decisive advantage against fast-charging horsemen and fast-shooting archers.
Mm-hmm.
Although Europeans began making cannons in the first half of the 14th century, it was 2 centuries later before military battles began to be won by field artillery. The immobility of heavy early cannons, which limited their usefulness on land, was not as much of a handicap at sea, however, where the warship itself provided the mobility for its cannon, leading to European dominance on the oceans of the world long before the mass territorial conquests which created European land empires overseas. The technology of shipbuilding and the science of navigation were crucial in determining which European powers would become the militarily predominant ones, both in Europe itself and overseas, raising some to new heights and reducing others from their former preeminence. Venice, for example, was the leading sea power of the continent for centuries before the era of sail and cannon, but later had to be protected from Spanish naval attack by the warships of their British and Dutch allies in the early 17th century. With the development of lighter, more mobile, more accurate, and faster firing artillery, as well as corresponding advances in pistols and rifles, the balance of military power shifted decisively to the Europeans, on land as well as at sea. Conquests often have not only cultural consequences, but also cultural antecedents. While one culture may be more effective militarily and another culture more effective economically, in many cases the two things interact. For example, more efficient methods of agriculture or industry, capable of supporting higher population densities on a given amount of land, can give one side decisive military advantages in launching attacks with larger armies, whose conquests then spread more effective economic methods to new lands or peoples. In ancient times, sedentary agriculture was an epoch-making advance beyond seeking food by hunting or gathering the spontaneous products of nature, or by transient slash-and-burn planting methods. Because sedentary agriculture supported much higher population concentrations, it spread and transformed the world, not only by example, but also by conquest. Those groups still practicing slash-and-burn methods of cultivation, which usually support only thin population densities, were often forced off their lands and up into the hills or out into the hinterlands and backwaters by people from regions with more dense populations made possible by sedentary agriculture. Hunter-gatherers, who had not yet achieved even primitive forms of agriculture, were of course even more thinly spread, and therefore even more vulnerable. Rice cultivation supports especially heavy population densities, so it is not surprising that the irrigation systems crucial to rice cultivation in many parts of Asia were spread by conquests in China, India, and the southeastern regions of the continent. Ultimately, it is not simply territory that is conquered, it is people, and their subjugation can take the form not only of political subordination, but also of enslavement, whether in their own homelands or in other lands to which they are transported. Here, too, environmental factors have been major influences, more so than race, for example, in determining who would and would not be enslaved. While slavery existed around the world for thousands of years and has been abolished generally only within the past 2 centuries, it tended to decline with the rise of many powerful nation-states, whose armies and navies stood between their own people and marauders from outside who might attempt to capture and enslave them. Thus, the consolidation of nation-states around the world reduced the number of peoples who remained vulnerable to enslavement. The regions of the world which continued to be subjected to mass enslavement had much more in common geographically than racially. Typically, these were regions where internal geographical barriers made it more difficult to consolidate political control over areas large enough to produce powerful nation-states, able to protect their populations from marauding outsiders. The Balkan Mountains, which fragmented peoples culturally and isolated them from the economic and intellectual advances of the outside world, made this region a major supplier of slaves for centuries before Europeans turned to Africa as a source of slaves for the Western Hemisphere. Such geographical handicaps had other counterparts which kept the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa isolated from one another, as that whole region remained insulated from the outside world by the vast Sahara Desert to the north and 3 oceans on its other sides. In Asia as well, geographical isolation and the technological backwardness which so often went with it left many vulnerable peoples in stateless societies like those of Bali, which was raided for tens of thousands of slaves by peoples from more fortunate places. Other stateless peoples, or peoples only nominally part of states which lacked effective control of remote regions, continued to be victimized by marauders who captured and enslaved them. Hill tribes, slash-and-burn agriculturalists, scattered bands of nomads, and others living in the remote backwaters of Asia continued to be raided and enslaved on into the 20th century. In short, what successively removed various peoples of the world from the ranks of those vulnerable to being enslaved was the long process of consolidation of state power, whether their own or that of European imperialist nations. Thus, slavery was ended in the Philippines, for example, only after the American conquest of the islands, which did not simply replace the pre-existing authorities with new ones, but replaced them with a more powerful government in firmer control. In the Indonesian islands as well, the advance of Dutch power marked the retreat of slavery. More generally, the spread of Western imperialism in Asia during the 19th century was the principal factor in the decline of slavery there. In Africa, slavery remained resistant on into the 20th century, but here too it was the consolidation of European power that forced back the frontiers of slavery, whether it was the consolidation of French power in Morocco or Senegal, British power in many parts of Africa, or other European power in other regions of the continent. What was crucial to this development was the emergence in Western civilization of a general revulsion against slavery in the late 18th and early 19th century. This anti-slavery movement became and remained politically powerful enough to force political leaders and colonial officials into opposition to slavery, regardless of whether they personally felt such revulsion or not. The other crucial factor was that the West had such overwhelming military superiority at the time as to be able to enforce anti-slavery policies around the world, as it imposed its will in other matters.
That's a very interesting take that I never thought about, especially because I like to focus on medieval, ancient side of history, especially where it's related to like military laws. Of course, that's how I know about like slavery outside of just, American slavery, because slavery is old as, I don't know, warfare or humans itself. When you talk about free labor and using that free labor to get something that you want at a much more easier or discounted rate, I don't know, it just sounds like blatant common sense or like a no-brainer before you have a more civilized, much more technologically advanced society. And I don't know, at the same time, this just goes back to my whole thing about us as a society or a civilization or a species as a whole for the most part advancing. And I think it's better to just be grateful that you don't live in a world where slavery is so prolific, at least compared to where it used to be. And in places where it does still go on, we choose to ignore it. Like the way it helps fuel our cell phones with, the minerals in Africa or the people making them in China. People love to ignore that type of stuff, but that still is slavery. But still at the same time, they still want to talk about, Western slavery. I'm not saying we should just ignore it and say it didn't happen. Of course it happened. But at the same time, I mean, as a black American and somebody whose ancestors were slaves, I'm not going to use that stuff as an excuse for what's going on nowadays. I have the opportunity to make something in my life, and that's what I'm gonna focus on. Slavery and conquest and warfare, and my I don't know experience and reading and studying, mostly just comes with suffering, and that's for men, women, children, anybody involved. The men be on the front lines and they die. The women have to be enslaved or get taken advantage of after, and the children are first forced to have no fathers, no mothers, and sometimes be slaves themselves. Either way, I'm just grateful that we don't live in that time period no more. But at least for the most part, it doesn't go on. That's the part of the thing with having technology and having a much more of, I don't know, globally connected world, economically and politically. That comes with good and bad things that could lead to, world wars or global depressions. But also at the same time, it prevents, large scale wars happening between great powers that they used to have. Same thing that happened in World War One or World War Two, for the most part, is being prevented because of us progressing. I don't know, a little bit, at least morally, or at least society emotionally, and that's partially forced because of nuclear weapons. But at the same time, we can look at history and see the consequences of it. And I'm hoping we keep, I don't know, staying on this track of peace because I don't want to have our generation go through war. I don't want any generation to go through war. And it's crazy I say that because I study war so much, but maybe it's because my studying of war is why I hate it so much. I want to avoid it, at least for my generation and future generations. It's not good for our civilization or our species in general. So many people suffer, and so many dreams and hopes are lost because of warfare. Just look at World War One, World War Two, or any other war. And look at the diaries and the notes and thoughts of these men or women and children who has experienced this stuff. It's just sad and heartbreaking in my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. It's your boy Logos, and I'll see you next time. Peace.